I didn't say hello. The first thing my daughter-in-law said to me that Tuesday morning was, "Did you transfer the second installment yet?" Not good morning. Not how are you doing, Dad, just the money. I was standing in my kitchen, still holding my coffee mug, looking out at the backyard where the oak tree I planted 32 years ago was just starting to drop its leaves. October. The kitchen smelled like toast and the particular quiet of a house where only one person lives anymore. My wife Connie passed 4 years ago, pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. I think about her most in the mornings, when the house is still and there's no one to talk to about the small things, the weather, what's on the news, whether the oak is looking healthier this year than last. The phone had rung at 7:43. "Did you transfer the second installment yet?" she said, and her voice had that quality I had learned to recognize over the years. Efficient, clipped. The voice she used when she was managing something, not talking to someone. I told her I hadn't sent it yet. I'd been meaning to call my son Philip first, just to check in, see how things were going with the build-out. "The contractor needs it by Friday," she said. "We're already behind on the equipment lease." I said I understood. I told her I'd take care of it. She hung up without saying goodbye. I set the phone down on the counter and stood there for a moment with my coffee going cold. Outside, a single leaf came loose from the oak and spun down slow through the gray morning air. I watched it land on the grass and thought, not for the first time, that something had shifted, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I should back up. 18 months before that phone call, Philip sat across from me at the dining room table with a folder of papers and a look on his face that I hadn't seen since he was 17 and trying to convince me to let him drive to Colorado with his friends for spring break. Hopeful, a little nervous, trying to seem more confident than he was. He wanted to open a restaurant. Not just any restaurant, a farm-to-table place in a renovated building downtown, the kind of neighborhood that had gone from forgotten to fashionable in the past decade. The kind of place that food writers visit and Instagram accounts are built around. He had a concept, a chef he'd been talking to, a name picked out. He'd been researching it for 2 years, he said. It was something he'd always wanted to do. Philip is 41. He spent 15 years working in hotel management, a steady career that paid the bills and gave him a comfortable life, but never quite fit him the way a man's work is supposed to fit him. He had a restlessness about him that Connie used to call his untapped engine. She always believed in him more vocally than I did. I believed in him too. I want to be clear about that. I just tended to show it differently. I asked questions. I poked at the plan to see where it was soft. His wife Renata had come up with the structure. She was a CPA, meticulous and organized, and she had put together a financial projection that looked serious on paper. The restaurant would cost roughly $400,000 to open. Renovations, kitchen equipment, initial inventory, permits, staffing for the first 3 months. They had saved about $90,000. They were applying for an SBA loan for another $120,000. They needed me to contribute the remaining $200,000. I asked how the loan would be structured. Renata explained that the business entity would be an LLC with Philip listed as the primary owner and herself as co-owner. The investment from me would be treated as a family loan, not equity. I would not have an ownership stake. I asked why not. She said it was cleaner that way, fewer complications at tax time, simpler if anything changed down the road. I sat with that for a moment. $200,000 is not nothing. It is, in fact, most of what I have left after the medical bills from Connie's illness and the life I've built since. I spent 37 years as a structural engineer. I was careful with money my whole adult life. Not miserly, but careful. I drove the same truck for 11 years. I took one real vacation every 3 years. I put Philip through college without loans. And I kept a cushion for myself, because I had watched my own father run out of money at 78 and spend his last years depending on the kindness of relatives. And I had promised myself that would never happen to me. $200,000 was most of my cushion. I asked Philip directly, "Is this what you want? Not Renata's dream? Yours." He looked me in the eye and said yes. He said he thought about it every day. He said he wanted to build something that would still be standing when he was my age. I said I'd think about it. I thought about it for 3 weeks. I talked to my accountant. I talked to a friend of mine, Vic, who had run a small business for 20 years and knew the risks better than most. I read about the restaurant industry, which is brutal and unforgiving and fails more often than it succeeds. I drove downtown and sat in my truck outside the building Philip was looking at, a two-story brick place with arched windows on the ground floor, and I tried to imagine his name above the door. I said yes. I wired the first installment, $100,000, in November. The second installment, another $100,000, was due the following spring when the build-out was further along. Between those two dates, I called Philip once a week. Sometimes he picked up, sometimes he didn't. When he did, the conversations were warm enough but thin. He was busy, I understood that, but there was something a little careful about the way he talked to me now, like he was narrating rather than confiding. He'd give me updates. The kitchen equipment was on order, the chef had signed on, the permits were taking longer than expected. But he didn't ask for my opinion, and he didn't offer the kind of detail you share with someone who's in it with you. I noticed that. I filed it away. It was Renata's call that April, the one asking about the second installment, that made me pay closer attention. After I hung up, I sat down with my coffee and did some math. The second installment was due to unlock, per our informal agreement, once the build-out was 70% complete. Philip and I had talked about this. I wanted to see progress before I sent more money. It wasn't distrust, it was just how I was built. Milestones matter. But I had not heard from Philip with an update in 6 weeks. No photos of the space. No walkthrough call. Nothing. I called him that afternoon. It went to voicemail. I called again the next morning. Voicemail. I sent a text. Something light. Hey, just trying to catch up. How's the build-out coming? He responded 3 hours later with, Good, busy week, talk soon. That was it. I stared at that message for a while. Then I put on my coat and drove downtown. The building had been transformed. When I had last seen it 8 months earlier, it was a gutted shell with plywood over the windows and a permit notice on the door. Now the windows were clear, fitted with warm amber-tinted glass that glowed even in the flat April light. The sign above the door was up, dark wood with brass lettering. The restaurant had a name. It was not the name Philip had mentioned to me 18 months ago. It was something different, something that sounded like Renata. I stood on the sidewalk across the street and looked at it. Through the front window, I could see the interior. White walls, wood beams, pendant lights, tablecloths. A woman arranging flowers in a vase near the host stand. The restaurant was open. Not preview opened, not soft opened. Opened. There was a chalkboard sign on the sidewalk with that day's specials. There were people inside. I got back in my truck and drove home. I didn't call Philip that night. I needed to be still for a while. I needed to sit with what I'd seen and not say anything until I was sure I could say it without my voice doing something I'd regret. I cooked dinner. Chicken thighs, roasted potatoes, the same meal I've made 100 times because it doesn't require much thought and I like the smell of it in the house. I ate at the kitchen table. Outside, the oak was full and green, the backyard quiet in the evening. I kept thinking about the opening, the chairs being arranged, the chalkboard, the sign. Philip had not told me his restaurant had opened. I had given this man $200,000, more if you count the first installment, and he had not called me to say, Dad, we're open. Come see it. I called him the next morning, early before I could think too much about it. He picked up. I said, I drove by the restaurant yesterday. There was a pause. Short, but I heard it. Yeah, he said. It's been open a few weeks. A few weeks. I said, when did you open? He said early March. They'd had a small opening dinner, just close family and a few friends. It was low-key, he said. They didn't want to make a big deal of it. I said, was I invited? Another pause. Longer this time. He said they'd kept it really small. Just Renata's parents, her sister, a couple of their friends. They hadn't done a formal thing. They were planning a bigger celebration later, once they were past the first month. I said, Philip, I put in $200,000. He said he knew that. He said he appreciated it. He said things had just moved fast and they made decisions quickly and he was sorry I hadn't heard sooner. I asked him what the name of the restaurant meant, the name I'd seen on the sign. He told me it was something Renata had suggested based on her grandmother's name. I asked if my name was anywhere in the business, on the LLC, on any of the documentation. He said it wasn't. That was the structure they'd set up, he reminded me. Family loan, not equity. I asked if there was a formal loan agreement, signed, with repayment terms. There was a silence. "Dad," he said, "we talked about this." I said, "We talked about a lot of things." I told him I needed to see the business documentation, the LLC filing, the operating agreement, the financials to date. I told him I wasn't asking as a partner. I understood I wasn't a partner. I was asking as a man who had given $200,000 of his retirement savings to this project and who had not been told when it opened. He said he would talk to Renata and get back to me. He did not get back to me that day. Or the next. What happened next came from a source I didn't expect. My accountant, a man I've worked with for 20 years named Vic's brother-in-law. Actually, no, his name is Stuart Cook, had a client who ran a business in the same building as the restaurant. Not inside the restaurant, just in the same block. Small city, the kind where people know people. Stuart called me on a Wednesday afternoon and said, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to hear me out before you react." He had heard, through the kind of casual professional overlap that happens in a city this size, that the restaurant had applied for a business line of credit. Standard enough, but the application had listed the ownership structure of the LLC, and something in it had caught the attention of someone Stuart knew. There was a third name on the LLC, not Philip, not Renata, a management company. The management company was registered in Delaware, common for liability purposes. Nothing unusual about that on its face. But the registered agent was a name neither Stuart nor I recognized. I asked Stuart what he thought it meant. He said he didn't want to speculate. He said I should have a lawyer look at it. I called a lawyer that afternoon, an attorney I'd dealt with years ago on a property matter, a sharp woman named. I'll call her my attorney. I don't want to get into her name. She pulled the public filings that same day. The Delaware LLC had been registered 14 months earlier. Its single member was listed as a holding company. That holding company had one registered officer, Renata. I sat in my attorney's office and read the documents 3 times. The restaurant, the business my son had presented to me as his dream, the thing he'd always wanted to build, had a structure underneath it that routed partial ownership through an entity that existed before the restaurant, before Philip came to me for money, before any of it. My attorney said, "This could be legitimate tax planning. It's not automatically sinister." I said I understood. She said, "But it's also the kind of structure you use when you want to make sure that if the visible business incurs liability, or if a personal relationship changes, certain assets are insulated." I said I understood that too. She asked me if I had a signed loan agreement with Philip. I told her we had done it on trust. He was my son. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Okay, here's what I can do for you." I did not call Philip in a rage. I want to be clear about that because I think it matters. I have never been a man who leads with anger. Connie used to say I process things like a glacier, slowly, completely, and then unmovably. I think she meant it as a mild criticism, but I always took it as a compliment. I spent a week getting my understanding of the situation as complete as it could be. I met with Stuart twice. I met with my attorney twice. I read everything I could read. Then I called Philip and asked him to meet me, in person. Not the restaurant. I suggested a diner we'd been going to since he was in high school, a place on Route 9 with red vinyl booths and a coffee that tastes like it's been sitting since 1987. Neutral ground. Familiar ground. Familiar ground. He came alone. I noticed that. I had a folder on the table when he sat down. I didn't open it right away. I ordered coffee. I asked how things were going at the restaurant, how the first month had been. He answered carefully. Good numbers. Strong weekends. The chef was working out. Then I opened the folder. I walked him through what I had found. The Delaware LLC. The holding company. The timeline. Registered 14 months ago, well before he'd come to me with his proposal. I didn't raise my voice. I laid it out the way I used to lay out. Load calculations at work. Here is the structure. Here's what it means. Here are the questions I need you to answer. Philip's face did something complicated while I talked. I've known that face since it was 7 years old, since it was 12, and trying not to cry when we had to put the dog down, since it was 22 and scared at his mother's hospital room door. I know every version of that face. What I saw now was not defiance. It was not the face of someone caught in a scheme. It was something worse in its way. It was the face of someone who had known something was wrong and had chosen not to look at it. He said he hadn't set up the Delaware company. He said that had been Renata's idea, for asset protection purposes, and that she had handled all of it, and he had signed where she told him to sign. I said, Philip, you signed documents setting up a company designed to route ownership of this business away from your own name, and you didn't ask me what that might mean for the money I'd given you. He said he trusted her. He said she was a CPA. She understood this stuff. He didn't. I said, she's your wife, but she's not my family in the same way you are. And she was in a position where her interests and my interests were not the same. He looked down at the table. I said, I'm not here to blow up your marriage. I'm not here to blow up the restaurant. I want to tell you what I've decided, and I want you to understand why. He looked up. I told him that I had spoken with my attorney. The informal loan arrangement we had was unenforceable as written, which is to say, not written at all. I could not compel repayment through any instrument I currently held. What I could do was put everything on a formal footing going forward. I told him I would not be sending the second installment. He started to say something. I said, let me finish. I told him that I was willing to restructure. If he wanted the remaining $100,000, it would come with a signed promissory note, notarized, with a repayment schedule, collateral, and a clause that allowed me independent access to the restaurant's quarterly financials for as long as any portion of the loan was outstanding. I told him the note would need to be reviewed and signed by both him and Renata. I also told him that I would need a full accounting of how the first $100,000 had been used, line by line. He said, Dad, that feels like? I said, Philip, I am 64 years old. Your mother is gone. This money is what I have. I gave it to you because I believed in you, and I still do. But believing in someone and being careless with my own future are two different things. I should have put this in writing from the beginning. That's on me, but we're putting it in writing now. He nodded, slowly. He didn't look relieved, but he didn't look angry either. He looked for the first time in a long while like a man seeing something clearly. We sat there for another hour, not talking about the money mostly, talking about his mother, about what she would have thought of the restaurant. She would have loved it, honestly. The aesthetic, the warmth, the idea of Philip building something. We talked about the oak tree in my backyard, which he climbed as a kid and which he said he thought about sometimes, weirdly, when he needed to calm down. Before we left, I paid the check. Old habit. He hugged me in the parking lot. Her real hug, not a see-you-later hug. Renata called me that evening. I had expected this. I had been expecting it since the moment Philip left the diner. She was controlled at first, professional, the way she always was. She said she wanted to discuss the conditions I had laid out. She said she thought some of them were excessive. She said the promissory note was fine, but the quarterly financial access was intrusive and might create issues with their operating agreement. I let her talk. When she finished, I said, Renata, I want to be straightforward with you. I don't have any bad feelings toward you personally, but I've made a significant financial decision on the basis of trust, and I've learned that there were structures in place that I wasn't told about. Going forward, everything is going to be on paper. That's not negotiable. She said, do you know how many families fall apart over this kind of thing? Bringing lawyers into family business? I said, I know how many parents lose their retirement savings. That's the number I'm thinking about. There was a pause. She said, Philip is going to be caught in the middle of this? I said, Philip is a grown man. He can make his own choices, and right now the choice is simple. He can sign a formal agreement and receive the second installment, or he can work with what he has. Either way, I will still be his father. That part isn't on the table. She said she needed to think. I said, take all the time you need. She hung up. I stood in my kitchen again, same spot as that first call, the one where she'd asked about the transfer without saying good morning. The oak was dark outside, just a shape against the evening sky. I made dinner. I ate at the kitchen table. I went to bed. 3 weeks later, Philip sent me a document, the promissory note, drafted by a business attorney he'd hired separately, not Renata, not Stewart, his own person, which I took as a meaningful sign. The terms were close to what I'd outlined. Repayment over 7 years, 3% interest, quarterly financials shared with me electronically, collateral in the form of his personal equity stake in the LLC. I reviewed it with my attorney. She suggested 2 changes. Philip accepted them. We signed in early June. Philip came to my house. We sat at the dining room table, the same table where he had laid out his folder 18 months earlier with his hopeful, nervous face. And we signed the documents, and I handed him a cashier's check for the remaining $100,000. He shook my hand. Then he hugged me. "I'm sorry," he said, "for all of it." I said, "I know." I didn't say more than that because I didn't need to. He understood. The restaurant had its first full year recently. By all accounts, including the quarterly report I received in January, it did well. Not spectacular, not viral, but solid. The kind of numbers that mean a second year is coming. Philip and I have dinner there once a month now. He reserves the corner table, the one near the window where the light comes in, soft in the late afternoon, and we sit for 2, sometimes 3 hours. We talk about the menu, the regulars he's getting to know, a server who reminds him of a kid we both knew growing up. We talk about his mother. He told me recently that he named one of the dishes after her. Nothing formal, just what the kitchen calls it, a roasted beet salad with walnuts and a champagne vinaigrette that Connie used to make at home. I don't know what the future holds with Renata. I don't know what conversations she and Philip have at home about me, about the agreement, about any of it. I've made my peace with not knowing. What I know is that my son and I are having dinner again. Real dinner. The kind where you say what you mean. My attorney sent me a note after we closed the deal. She said I had handled it well. She said most people in my position either go silent and lose everything, or blow up and lose the relationship. She said I had managed to protect myself without declaring war. I keep that note in the folder with the promissory note. The lesson, if there is one, isn't about the money. The money is just paper, a number, a representation of years of work and care and deferred comfort. The lesson is this: love does not require you to be careless. You can give everything you have to someone and still ask for it to be honored in writing. You can trust your child completely and still protect yourself from the variables you cannot control. A signed agreement is not suspicion. It is respect for the relationship, for the stakes, for the fact that adults should treat each other like adults, even when they are also family. Connie would have said something shorter. She would have looked at me over her coffee cup and said, "You should have done that 18 months ago, Hal." She would have been right. She usually was. I keep coming back to the oak tree in my backyard. Not because it's symbolic, just because that's where my eyes went during the hardest moments of all this. Through the kitchen window, out at that tree. I planted it the year Philip was born. It's taller than the house now. There's something that happens when you do right by people for a long time. You start to believe that doing right is enough. That it speaks for itself. That the people who've seen it, who've benefited from it, will simply remember. I believed that about my son. I believed that 40 years of showing up for his school, his college, his grief, his dreams, had built something that didn't need to be written down. That kind of thinking is not generosity. It's a kind of laziness dressed up as faith. What I understand now is that goodness without clarity is incomplete. I was a good father. I am still a good father. But I handed $200,000 to people without a single signed document, and I told myself it was love. It was love. It was love. It was also careless. Those two things can be true at the same time, and pretending otherwise is how people end up sitting in an attorney's office reading Delaware LLC filings at 64 years old. Philip is not a bad person. I want to say that plainly because it matters. He's a man who trusted someone else's judgment when he should have applied his own, and who avoided an uncomfortable conversation with his father until his father made the conversation unavoidable. That's a failure of nerve, not of character. There's a difference. Nerve can be rebuilt. I've watched him rebuild it over the past year. In the way he hired his own attorney, in the way he showed up to that diner alone, in the way he set up to that diner alone, in the way he said, "I'm sorry," without trying to explain it away. That took something. I noticed it. What I've learned. And I say this as a man who spent 37 years calculating how much weight a structure could hold before it failed, is that clarity is not the enemy of love. It is the condition that allows love to survive under pressure. A signed agreement between a father and son is not suspicion. It is two people deciding that the relationship matters enough to protect it from the things that money tends to do to people when the terms are vague and the stakes are high. I also learned that when something feels off, it probably is. Not always in the dramatic way. Not fraud, not malice, but off in the quieter sense. The calls that go to voicemail a few too many times. The updates that stop coming. The opening you were never invited to. Those things are data. I ignored the data for months because I didn't want to be the kind of father who kept score. But keeping your eyes open is not the same as keeping score. Wisdom isn't suspicion. It's just paying attention and having the spine to act on what you see. The promissory note is in a folder in my desk drawer. The quarterly report from the restaurant is beside it. Philip and I have dinner there once a month. Last time, he told me the roasted beet salad, the one the kitchen calls Connie's, had become one of their most ordered dishes. I paid the check. Old habit. The oak is still standing.